The kids will come and ask questions. Most important part of the conversation is just saying to them, being curious about it is completely normal. Wanting to know what happens and wanting to ask questions about it is totally normal because we don't have a solid answer. Some people will be really deeply uncomfortable, but you and I, we can have big conversations about that.
Welcome, Erin. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Jill. I'm excited to join you and to have a chat.
Awesome. Well, let's start off with the basic questions of where are you from? And tell me a little bit about your background, how old you are, maybe your religious beliefs growing up, things like that.
Cool. Well, as you can tell from the accent and not in America, I am a born and bred New Zealander. I grew up in the North Island of New Zealand, have spent the last 15 years in the South Island of New Zealand, and I'm currently transitioning from New Zealand to Canada, actually. So we're off to Canada in a couple of months and then on to the UK and Europe. So yeah, stepping out of the comfort zone a little. I am, for all intents and purposes, a colonial child, I guess. My grandparents and great-grandparents and their parents, again, were all, British, white. One side of the family is Church of England. The other side of the family came from, Ireland and those sorts of places. A little bit of Catholicism in there, a fair dose of atheism as well through the years. And now I am 40 and living in a reality where religion doesn't play a part in my life. I have never had religion in my life. My parents are both firmly non-religious. It's interesting because I think as a colonial child, you grow up believing in heaven and hell and those sorts of things, regardless of your religious beliefs. It's like it's ingrained in your culture, but you're also raised with the belief that you don't talk about things that are uncomfortable or emotional or that might hurt. That's something that has always been uncomfortable for me because it's not my natural state to ignore how I feel. There's kind of been that, I guess, growing up, that real juxtaposition of we don't talk about stuff that hurts, but actually stuff hurts and we should talk about it. I'm married to another white colonial child. My wife is 5 years older than I am, and she has a very similar background, I would say. And we have two young boys. The eldest is 11 and the youngest is 8. And they keep it real in terms of death and dying and all of those sorts of things. We've experienced the loss of my mother-in-law. We've also experienced the loss of friends and other family members, and most recently our beloved pets. So we have regular conversations about death and dying and that sort of thing in our household, but that's probably not the norm for our family as a wider construct.
That sounds pretty similar to me, even though we grow up in very different areas of the world. Yeah. I'm still in the United States, very much under that like puritanical white kind of patriarchal where doing bad means you're going to go to hell and doing good means you're going to go to heaven. And if you're lazy, you're definitely going to hell. And like, don't talk about things that are sensitive or God forbid you show any emotion. It's that very, I don't even know how it makes me feel. It doesn't make me feel good. And I don't think it ever made me feel good, even as a child. I wanted to be more open and free and talk about things. And then the conversations get shut down. And I'm also, sanitized is a great word for it. Yes. Yeah. I have children almost the same age as yours. So my daughter is 9 and my son's 12. They just had birthdays a couple weeks ago. And I'm trying to have conversations that are more, I don't know if open is really the word that I want, but more conversations that allow them to express their emotions and to ask the questions that maybe I don't even have an answer for, because I want them to feel that that's the appropriate way of living life. But of course, other people are already starting to connect with them. Like, for example, over Christmas, he hugged my son and kissed his head. And he said, "Please don't kiss me. I don't like to be kissed." And they looked at me with that kind of funny look. And I said, "Yeah, he doesn't like to be kissed. He won't even let me kiss him." And the response was, "Oh, okay then." And they walked away, all kind of perturbed about it. But I was really proud of him for speaking up for what was his boundaries, rather than what I would have done when I was a kid, was just dealt with it and felt really gross and uncomfortable and just moved on with my day. So it's interesting to watch the way that society is going to kind of interact with children that are being raised to feel comfortable talking about hard things. How did the conversations with your children go around the loss of pets or the death of your mother-in-law? Because we thankfully haven't had to have that conversation yet with our children, especially around the death of like either of our parents. Dogs, yes, but it's still different. It's still heartbreaking. I mean, we all cried about the dog. The parents, how did that conversation go?
We come from a space of having death sanitized, and talking about heaven is, for want of a better way of describing it, it's almost gaslighting, right? It's like, oh, well, grandma's in heaven now. Like that's somehow supposed to make us feel better. We were very deliberate in not suggesting that that's what was going on. When my mother-in-law passed, our youngest wasn't even born yet. So it was some time ago, but we've had regular conversations, especially in the last 2 years, about the process of losing grandma and how we can honor her moving forward and how she still plays a role in our lives and those sorts of things. And that's probably a whole other conversation. But having a conversation about losing her and what that looks like and feels like for each of us is something that we were really deliberate about. I spoke to our eldest initially about it because that he was doing a family tree for school, and he was like, I don't remember grandma. My wife hadn't processed her grief in any way, shape or form around losing her mum. And so she didn't talk about her. She just wouldn't talk about her at all. And so I said to my son, well, Pop will tell you that grandma's gone to heaven. I don't believe that she's in heaven. I don't believe there is a heaven, but I know that she is still around, and I know that she is still present with us. And I know that we will be with her again because the connection is still strong. And I know that she influences both of our children because there are aspects of them that could only come from her. They can't come from anywhere else. And so I explained that. I said, when I see mummy do this face, that's her mum. And when I see you saying this thing or poking your tongue out when you're writing, that's grandma. That's grandma all over. And so we had that kind of conversation about how, and I guess this is in part because of my own evolution in terms of what I believe, but we had a conversation around the fact that the only connection to grandma that we've really lost is the physical. We can still maintain an emotional connection because we can still love her and be loved by her and be guided by her. We can maintain the mental connection because we can bring forward memories and we can talk about her and we can share stories about her and all of that sort of thing. But that physical connection is the one that we've lost. And so by focusing and putting our energy into the others, the loss feels less. We went through that kind of conversation with them. That helped when we then had to explain that our dog was unwell, and then we had to explain that our cat was unwell, and we've been through those processes, and we've had close friends. I lost a friend to cancer a couple of years ago where we had the same sort of conversation, and we've had various iterations of that conversation, and the kids will come and ask questions. And that's, I think, probably the most important part of the conversation is just saying to them, like, being curious about it is completely normal. Wanting to know what happens and wanting to ask questions about it is totally normal because we don't have a solid answer. We don't have this is what it looks like. And so the curiosity, follow that. Be curious about it. Ask the questions. Some people will be really deeply uncomfortable. Like, don't ask those questions of my parents because they won't respond well to that. They'll just shut it down. But you and I, we can have big conversations about that.
I love the deep conversations that I can get into with my children about things that other people would find uncomfortable. And sometimes my initial reaction is to almost feel uncomfortable and kind of shut down the conversation. But that's just my old programming and the way that I was taught. And I've had to learn to really question sometimes why I don't want to have the conversation. And of course, there's age-appropriate conversations with children. If my kids, because they know the work that I do. And so sometimes if I'm telling my husband a little bit about an experience that I was having, like, for example, I volunteer at a hospital, and one of the patients that I ended up seeing was a younger person, and they were 38 and they were dying. And it was a thing for me because that's younger than I am. And it's some child and the parents were there. And so I was like feeling some emotions about it. And talking to my husband about it.
Yeah.
And of course, the kids, they ignore you until they hear something they're not supposed to hear. And then they're like, wait, what'd you just say?
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
And so I had the little bit of a conversation because this person was actually dying from alcohol abuse.
Mm-hmm.
I just said a little bit about it. I didn't get into details, but also I don't think that at 12 years old, that's too young for a child to understand that alcohol is okay in moderation, but that it can be abused and it could lead to an early death.
Yeah.
But there's other people that would have had a heart attack if I ever told them that I had that conversation with my son, because that's not appropriate.
Yeah.
But also, I really don't want my son to become an alcoholic and die at 38. I'd rather have that conversation now than to be that parent that was in the hospital asking if they could get into bed with their child as they died.
Yeah.
Because that's heartbreaking to me.
Yeah.
So I love
that.
these honest conversations, and I love that children ask all kinds of questions of you. Now, I want to know a little bit, because I know a little bit about your work. So why don't you tell us about the work that you do? Because it's really interesting, all of it. And I hear you're doing some new stuff, and I really want to hear about that.
This is probably part of the evolution of my belief system in some ways, I guess. I've always been surrounded by death and grief. Like, as long as I can remember, I can access stories and memories and feelings around all of that stuff. I'm writing a book about that very thing, about all the various experiences of death and grief and what they look like and how it feels to hold that.
Really quickly, what do you mean by access?
So like, how do I access that?
Yeah, because you said like you access it. And so part of me is like, wait, I don't really get what that means.
Well, I think people shut it down, right? Like, my experience of it, observationally, is that there are people in my life who just shut it down. And my wife is a prime example. Her mum has been gone now 9.5 years. And it's only in the last 12 months that she's actually started to process her memories of her mum, her grief. She just basically, the minute that her mum passed, it all just stopped. There was just nothing. And she wasn't prepared to access it because it hurt. And she didn't feel like she could control the hurt enough to be safe. So she just shut it down. When we get to a level of comfort around our own understanding of what happens when we die and what grief is and what it looks like and feels like for us, then I think we can access it more freely. We can open the door to it, and then we can put it back when we're done with it. It's not this overwhelming, I can't control it, I can't put it away kind of thing. It's a thing where I can take it out, I can touch it, I can feel it, I can be with it and sit with it. But I also know that I can put it away again, and that's actually an okay process for me. So that's what I mean around accessing. My journey with grief in the last, I would say, 3 years has really evolved quite dramatically. I used to hold it. I used to be the holder. I didn't necessarily keep it in a locked cabinet, but I didn't have any ability to control it or control access to it. I would be overwhelmed by it at times and live in a deep, dark cave of grief for days and days, and kind of felt like I was a collector of grief without being a processor of grief. I would pick it up and I would put it on top of the last box that came in, and then I'd pick up another one and put it on top of that. And so sometimes it would all fall over and other times it would be okay. And then I was a psychic medium and that I could access the ancestral realm and that I could speak to the dead, I guess, speak to my loved ones in spirit, but also speak to others who are not connected to me. And that in an instant changed the way that I saw death and dying. It became much less of a finishing point and much more of a transition that is part of a much, much bigger journey than I could evolve earlier in my life. And I always kind of believed in reincarnation and that kind of thing. Like, I think there was always a part of me that was like, I feel like I've lived before. I feel like I've done this before. I have knowledge of stuff that I shouldn't, but I didn't really have any context for it until I started to actually understand that the veil between our physical realm and the ancestral realm is much, much thinner and more accessible than I thought. And so that kind of allowed me to understand a little bit more about my own beliefs around death and dying. It's not this painful endpoint that we were taught it is. And that has changed the way I view grief as well. I know that grief is about the physical more than any else, which is why we hold it physically. When we grieve, we feel it in our chest. It's heavy, it's hard, it hurts. We feel it in our throat, that lump that you can't swallow down. And so being able to come to an understanding around that, gate away to the point that I'm at now, has allowed me to not just help myself, but to support my loved ones around that, and also to serve others. And so I do work with other people around grief and processing grief, connecting with their loved ones again. So, that might be a transactional, like I'm just going to do a reading, or it might be much more a relationship thing where we at a place where they can then keep and maintain a connection with their loved one in spirit and pay reverence to them and connect with them and seek guidance and that sort of thing. I firmly believe everyone is capable of that. And I firmly believe that our loved ones in the ancestral realm are waiting for us to invite them in to do that. So that's the work that I spend the majority of my energy in that space doing. And it's a beautiful thing. Like, it's a beautiful thing to hold space for someone who is grieving, as you do for the process. I kind of see my process as the other side of the transition. You're like holding them and guiding them and loving them and just being the space holder, I guess, as they navigate their way towards that transition point. And then I kind of see mine as the other side of that, where I'll call ancestors in and invite them to receive someone and nourish them and love them and work through the healing process with that person, and then their loved ones in the physical realm to support them and to love them and to connect with them again. It's just a really beautiful process. That whole death and dying is something that I think should be celebrated. It's a really beautiful process when you don't think of it an ending. It's a little bit like birth in some ways. That's probably where my beliefs have navigated to. But I know that there's a lot of grief that we hold that isn't ours as well. That's certainly a big part of the work that I'm coming into, and the book that I'm writing and that sort of thing, is we hold a lot of grief that isn't ours. There's collective grief, and I think the pandemic has brought that forward in a big way. There are communities within society that have been holding that for a long, long time. You look at Jewish people or Muslim people or Black people, like people of color, they all carry collective grief that isn't necessarily theirs experientially. It is innate in them, and it's something that influences how they take on their own grief in their own life. And so that's kind of where I'm moving to a little bit more, is looking at how do we carry grief that we came to this life with, or that we have taken on that isn't ours, and how does that influence our own journey around grief stuff. It does play a really big part, and it's something that we need to talk about a lot more and actually allow a lot more.
I love all of that. First off, there's like so many different things. So one thing I want to ask about is being raised Catholic. There's still a big part of me that when I even think about trying to connect with spirits, even if they're my ancestors, I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to invite in the devil. What am I even thinking of? I love hearing that that's a big part of the work that you do. And I do believe that any of us could do it, and that I maybe do have ancestors that are waiting for me. Like, hey, Jill, come on. I've been trying to tell you this thing for the last 20 years and you're just not listening. Yeah. But part of me is afraid that if I open that door, what else is going to come in? Is that a realistic belief? Is that something that you ever deal with? How does that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, without wanting to put the fear of anything into anybody, not all spirit or ancestors are well and healthy. Some of them are really unwell. Inviting those in can sometimes be problematic. I've certainly had experiences on a personal level where I've had unwell ancestors want to connect, looking for healing, looking for support and love, because like I said, it's a two-way street. They can guide us, but we can guide them and heal them and help them. That was something that was really problematic for me when I was first entering this world, I guess. I struggled with being able to shut it down. I didn't know how. I've built up a toolkit now that allows me to do that. And one of the first things I would encourage anyone who is looking to make connection with spirit or with loved ones in spirit is just set up really good protection for yourself in whatever way feels right. Some people will invite angels in, because angels are beings of light, and therefore any darkness they're going to take care of. Some people will carry crystals because that is their go-to method of feeling grounded and protected. I set up bubbles of protection with any of my clients. We go through a process of connecting to the earth and the ancestral realm and setting up a protective bubble. You can ask your loved ones who you know are loving to come in and provide that protective bubble. I think the thing that I've come to understand about the ancestral realm is that they are loving beings who want us to thrive. We are the legacy that they have left behind. It is in their interest for us to be well and to be happy and to thrive. And it's in our interest to invite them to support us because they are loving and they will guide us and support us. So I do understand that whole concept of fear around opening the door to something that you don't understand. I think my advice would be to start with something that feels much less big. So start with a reverence practice, for example. And what I mean by that is setting up like an altar in your home where you've got photos of loved ones in spirit, where you can light candles for them or leave offerings for them, place items of importance like jewelry, or, it might be, so I have a client who leaves a glass of whiskey by her grandfather's photo on special occasions, because that's her making an offering to him and saying, I remember you and I love you and I invite you into my world. And so that's part of it. And telling stories, like the more that we share of them, the more that we sit with their energy, the more that we share that energy with the people around us, the more we invite that energy in. And they're only ever loving if we're doing that. We don't talk about people that weren't loving. We don't share stories and sit in the energy of people who we didn't love and want near. So inviting them in is the same process, and they will keep us protected. They will keep us, if they're close, and, we all have some who are more protective than others, but having them around us, it provides a layer of protection in itself. And yeah, I think you just have to kind of think of it as that almost, that, if you're inviting a grandfather in, for example, and he was the kind of man who would do anything for his family and who would step up if someone was in trouble and give them the shirt off his back kind of man, that energy hasn't changed, right? And he will still do that. He will still step up. He will still be there. He will still, make sure that no one can hurt his family, because that's an innate soul value, right? That's a core value that is made beyond this physical life. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does, because cool. I really kind of already do a lot of that.
Yeah.
I have my crystals that sometimes I carry them with me. Sometimes they're just in my room. I have my little altar space right on the other side of this computer with my grandmother's pictures and my candles and, all the things that I already do, surrounding myself in a bubble of essentially protective light.
Yeah.
Because going out into this world actually sometimes scares me more than the spirit world. 100%. But also there's still that part of me inside that my grandmother was very Catholic. And so even though I didn't necessarily go to church and believe a lot of what was being said, and I left the church as a teenager, it's still very deeply ingrained in me, just like all the other cult stuff that we already talked about a little bit, that it's still there. It kind of comes up at times when logically part of me is like, all right, you don't need that anymore. You don't need that belief anymore, but it still is there and it still pops up. And so when you were talking about that, I thought sometimes I would love to really connect with some of my ancestors that aren't my grandmothers that I knew, but maybe my grandfathers that I didn't really know.
You've definitely got a grandfather figure that's really present for you, which is interesting that you, I don't get the feeling that you did know each other, but he's really present and kind of stands out over your shoulder.
He always has.
Really protective. Yeah. And I think that it is one of those things where we can pay reverence to those that we know and remember really easily. Right. We can call them by name. We can call them forward in terms of what they looked like. And, and we go further back and then we lose the photos and then we lose the name and then we lose the places. The thing for me around that is that we can always examine where our roots go, but we already have that knowledge. It's in us. We already know who we come from. And so we don't have to necessarily have the evidence that humans look for. We don't need to know their names to know that they are loving and connected to us. We don't need to know what they did in their life or what they looked like or any of that stuff to know that there are aspects of our smile that come from them, or that the color of our hair comes from them, or whatever. Like, we know that that scientific process happens. And so we don't have to go looking for the evidence.
And it's
right?
hard to not want the evidence.
Yeah.
Part
Our
of the
humanness
brain
demands it.
Totally. And
Yeah.
I understand why. I mean, in some cases that serves us well, but in other cases, it just confuses my whole being when I can't find the evidence that part of me really feels like it needs to believe something to be true.
Yeah.
And then there's the other part of me that just intuitively knows and feels and almost just doesn't need the evidence. Like, I don't need that evidence. So the two parts kind of fight sometimes with each other.
That seeking evidence is a distraction, right? Like, it's pulling you away from believing in something that you can't see, that isn't tangible. Because as humans, that's what we're after all the time, is the tangible. And in part, that's the conditioning of generations of people being told to believe in something, ironically, that isn't tangible, but that there is only one source of truth, right? And I think that's the key when it comes to death and dying and grief, is there isn't a single source of truth there. We all have our own truth around that. And that's what we need to navigate our way to. I can't tell you what death and dying feels like or looks like. I can't tell you what happens on the other side, because you have to navigate your own understanding of that. You have to get to a point where you feel comfortable that that is your truth in that. And that will be different to mine. It'll be different to everyone's. And we have been raised in a society, especially as white colonial women, we have been told what to think and told what to believe and told that there is a single source of truth that comes from some man, and that's not the reality. So that even can feel a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit like we need evidence to be able to challenge it. We don't need evidence beyond our inner knowing that our truth is unshakable. And if it's not unshakable yet, and for a lot of us it won't be, then that's an invitation to explore it and be curious and to have conversations like this one and to actually really be open to all possibilities. Because then as we go through that, we can test for ourselves all the time. Is that my truth? Maybe aspects of it are and aspects of it aren't, and we throw those ones away. But it's journey, right? That's what we're here for in a large way. Going back to the conversation about conversations with our children and what society is going to think of them and how it's going to engage with them. I hope society feels really changed by our children, like in ways that make some people run for the hills and make others want to stand up and fight. I hope that our children go out there and challenge the status quo, because the status quo doesn't serve us and it doesn't serve the children who are going to grow up and challenge it. I'm excited by that prospect, and I love that you are having these kinds of conversations with your children too, because more of us need to be doing that, opening the dog for our children to be able to take our truth, what we've navigated our way to over 40 something years, and to then say, okay, well, I'm 10 and now I've got 30 years to navigate further. And when I hit 40 something, I'm going to be much further along than you were. Like, what more could we ask for, right?
Yeah, I don't find that threatening at all. And some people really do.
Yeah.
This idea of their children growing more than them or being smarter than them or whatever else. I want my children to question everything that I say. Both of our kids went to a Christian preschool because it was basically the only thing that we had access to at that point. And it was fine. My husband and I, neither one of us trashed Jesus or the church or anything else. But it was interesting having the kids come home and then ask us questions about Jesus and God. And I just kept, well, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think?
Yeah.
But even this past Christmas, my daughter, my son, and my husband had a conversation because my daughter said, well, of course, Jesus is white. He's white in all the pictures. And my husband said, well, given where he comes from in the world, the people from that area, they're not white. So why would he be any different? And she was very confused because she was like, but all the pictures of him are white. It was a good conversation to have in that there was no, well, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. It was just think about it. if everybody from that area of the world is of a darker skin tone, why would this one person that we only see in paintings that were all done by white people suddenly be white when everybody else from that area of the world was not? And so it was a good conversation that allowed her to think about it. And that's more of the conversations that I think we need to have about everything. Is so often we want to tell our children what to believe. And in some cases, it's for their own safety. We try to also make them understand that, yes, we're making you brush your teeth because you don't want your teeth to rot and fall out of your mouth. But just believe us on this one. But there's other things where it's like, well, no, why do you think it? Or let's think about it a different way, or let's look it up. And there's times when it's going to prove me wrong. And I think that's actually a good thing. I like being able to question what I believe. And even in my line of work, people will say, oh, well, what if somebody's Catholic, or what if they're Muslim, or what if they're Jewish? That's fine. I'm there to support people through the end of life where their beliefs are. It is not for me to say, well, those aren't my beliefs. I'm just there to support them with whatever they believe. And maybe they believe that there's heaven, or maybe they believe they're going to get reincarnated. I'm there to support all of that as well. Because it's not about my beliefs. And also I could maybe learn something. I like to learn new stuff. And so I love talking to different people that have beliefs that are different than mine, because maybe I can learn something new. If I just was so close to like my beliefs being the only right ones, what fun is that? You don't get to learn anything. Might as well die at 40 if I'm going to shut down at 40 and not learn anything.
Please don't. But I mean, it's not your journey, right? You're just a supporter along on their journey. And likewise with our children. I had this perception before we had children that I was going to teach my children all these things. I was going to teach them. I was going to impart all my wisdom. This whole thing that we're told about being a parent, being a good parent, is you teach your children to be good people. From the moment that my eldest son was born, and he came into the world early, he was small, he was in an incubator, he was teeny tiny and perfect. From the minute he was born, I knew that he was going to teach me more than I could ever teach him. And he continues to do that every day. I have to test my truth around a number of different things based on what he says or what he does and how he sees the world. And there is no greater teacher than our children, because they have come completely unencumbered by all the stuff that we carry. And because we are so convicted and not passing that on, it gives them free rein to challenge all of it. That's the thing that is, for me, one of the beautiful things is I have a really deep connectedness to my grandmothers in particular, but all of my grandparents and great-grandparents, and they're all in spirit, and my parents are living. But my children are the people who I feel most get me and most challenge me to be better. And I hope that that is true for a lot more people than will admit to it, because I think that is how, as a society, we shift from this fear-based single source of truth. This is what life looks like. This is what death looks like. This is how we shut it all down. That mentality, shifting that to a paradigm where we're like, actually, life and death are all part of a much bigger journey, and we can take from it whatever we choose. We always have a choice, and we can engage with it in a much more loving, open, honest way when we come from that place. I love that you're having those same moments with your children, and I know that you have that parallel concept of they're teaching you and they're there to challenge you, and we don't teach them anywhere as much as they teach us, I don't think. Yeah.
I agree completely. And I hope that there's people listening to this that now will maybe, first off, not feel so alone for the others that do it the way that we do, because I definitely get some weird looks. And even my mother sometimes will say, you talk to your children like they're adults. Well, yeah, why would I not? So hopefully there's people out there that now you don't feel so alone. And also maybe this will encourage some other parents to be a little bit more open and questioning with their children and embracing these conversations around death and dying and grief and life and all of the stuff that goes along with it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here with me today. I really appreciate this conversation. Is there any way that listeners can reach you? How would you like them to contact you?
At the moment, I'm in a bit of a state of flux in terms of my living situation. As I said, we're moving overseas and all of that sort of stuff. So the easiest way to connect with me is just Erin at awakeningthewisewoman.com via email, or, Erin Hodgson on Facebook, Erin Hodgson Awakening on Instagram. We have podcasts and radio shows and all kinds of things happening, but the richest and most rewarding way to connect with me will be to have a conversation. So reach out if you do want to have a conversation, and let's do it. I'm always open to it. I have many words, and I love being tested and being held in spaces like this. I think what you're doing and the way that you're doing it is really important work. And, for anybody who is even remotely curious about aspects of what we've talked about, talk to me or Jill. Don't sit with it and then put it away and don't engage with it anymore. Like, really engage with it and test what feels true for you and explore what feels curious. That's how we grow as people. If we don't grow, we might as well just wait to die, right? That process is really important.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'll put all of your links too in the show notes, so people don't have to try to write them down. They'll be in the show notes, and you can just contact Erin or me at any time. But awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.